Hello, everybody. Welcome to episode 80 of the Titanforge podcast. I'm Dratnos, joined by Tettles.
Hello, what's up?
Good afternoon. And Trell.
Good evening.
Good evening. Welcome. This week we are continuing with our Wednesday, Thursday schedule, which will be on probably for the next month or so. Month and a half? 2 months? Something like that?
Something like that, yeah, whenever MDI is over-ish.
Something that it seems like I probably should know, but in fact don't know quite as much as I should.
I don't know. It ends whenever it ends.
We'll see.
Dratnos and I just show up on every other weekend, alternating weekends to cast the MDI. We don't really know what
it's not also is. There's going to be a 2-weekend break between this coming cup, though, and the one after, because there's BlizzConline, where I'm pretty excited for that, because I think we should get to see probably not just 9.1, but 9.2 spoilers, if I had to guess. Because I think we got 8.1 and 8.2 spoilers at the BlizzCon 2 years ago. I think, yeah. I'm not 100% sure, so it's going to be a mystery. It's going to be an exciting mystery that gets solved for us.
Yeah, I have to shake my head every time I hear the word BlizzConline. It's just...
It's
like a bad dad joke.
That is a really bad dad joke, I agree.
Yes, I'm right there with you, but it's like it's the official name of the thing. It's not even like people are just shortening that. It's actually what it's called.
They actually named it BlizzConline. Yes.
Yep. So that's coming soon. We'll obviously talk about that. This week we are going to do a little bit of a theory episode. So this one's going to be about kiting as a tank, and how to help your tank kite as not a tank in a dungeon generally. There's a little bit of raid relevance here as well, but mostly be dungeon focused. Although this tier there's actually been quite a bit of tanking or kiting as a tank compared to an average tier, I would say.
I mean, there's a lot of mobs that are like, I feel like this tier more than in the past, there have been like a lot of tank mechanics that literally could just be outranged with Infernal Strike. Or like, okay, so Stone Legion Generals and Council of Blood are probably the ones that come to mind the most, where it's just, you literally leap away from the mechanic doesn't hit you, and it doesn't happen, and you're like, okay,
yeah,
well, this is kind of weird.
The Stone Legion Generals is more just like, you're ranging something. It's really Council of Blood that has an actual kite on it, where you are, there is the ad that you kite in the last phase. But that's pretty rare. It's pretty rare that a raid tier features that as like an actual strategy that everybody uses. Kiting as a tank in raid is usually like the boss is at 2% and you need to kill it, and 10 people are alive, and you're trying to kite the last little bit. Yeah.
I have a question.
Enraged.
So I heard this. I read this in your Discord, Dratnos. But can you confirm that the reason that you've been streaming a lot less lately is because you made $500,000 off of GameStop stock?
No, that's. I wish I'd been smart enough to buy GameStop at $40 or whatever, but
whatever Jack was telling us about it.
Yeah, that would have been pretty good. What's it at right now? It's back down, right? Yeah, it's down to $92 now. So it's the bubble has really burst on that.
I love the meme of Dratnos doesn't stream much anymore because he made so much money off of GameStop stock that he never has to press go live anymore.
It's Dogecoin, actually. I'm a Dogecoin investor.
That's where you made all your money, I see.
So that's what I've been up to. How about you, Tettles? How's your last couple days been going?
It's been going okay. I've been making some more consistent YouTube videos. Been doing that EU pugging series stuff. I think that the first video of the series went okay, but I think that I want to make them longer in the future. I think that it's better long-form content.
I understand that your guild has taken down Sire as well.
Ooh, yes. We got Sire. We actually got Hall of Fame, too, because there were only 96 guilds going into reset on the Horde side that had Hall of Fame. So now Trell and my guild are probably both getting Hall of Fame. I would suspect that Innocence is getting it right.
I sure hope so. They should kill tonight.
Yeah.
And if not tonight, then Monday.
How about you, Trell? Has it been going for you? How you been recovering nicely? All back up to speed?
Yeah, I'm actually like probably 85% back to normal, I think. I mean, it was pretty major surgery, so it's gonna be a while, but
that's good.
I can move around and do all my normal stuff for the most part.
Have either of you been playing this push week that has just started? And also, how would you guys rate this week compared to some of the other, good fortified weeks on the calendar?
I haven't been playing it much, but okay, so basically this week is, I would say it is like the third best fortified week, maybe fourth best fortified week, and it's not a bad week in terms of like completing dungeons. It's not like hard. There's no Grievous. There's no some of those more like difficult to deal with affixes, but it's like annoying and slow because of storming and inspiring, mostly inspiring, because there are like packs in a couple of dungeons, like Theater of Pain being a prime example of it, where it's just like the mobs, the inspired mobs themselves are so difficult to be able to deal with just generally. And then there are obviously some dungeons like Halls of Atonement, which are literally free. Like I do not think that there is a bad inspiring mob in Halls of Atonement. So it's definitely good for some dungeons. It's really bad for some dungeons. I think that overall, I would say it is a push week. It's not the best though.
Yeah, I think I'm inclined to agree there. It's tough because it's the only storming fortified week, and feels like storming should be a good push week affix generally for like the triple ranged comps.
Yeah,
but yeah, inspiring does throw a bit of a wrench in a lot of dungeons.
Yeah, I mean, even the Spiteful week, wasn't even that bad because, like you said, triple range comps. A lot of people are also playing like Windwalker or Rogue.
Yeah, it's true. So the
easily deal with Spiteful, but the Spiteful week was, I think, definitely easier than the Inspiring week because the Inspiring is the hardest to fix.
Yeah, it's Inspiring versus Volcanic on the other, the non-melee unfriendly affix row. I do think looking at this calendar, it has to be Bursting Volcanic that gets the nod. Yeah.
That one's I think orders of magnitude easier, like maybe multiple key dungeon levels higher, easier. I don't know what I'm gonna do for my Wowhead article series once we reach that week, because literally everything is just is there a level above S tier? Like I don't understand what I'm gonna do anymore.
All right, this kind of segues into a discussion a little bit out of order, but YOLO, let's do it this way, because there's an interesting change that's coming to the affixes that we'll start feeling it next week, which is to Tyrannical. So Tyrannical has been just nerfed by 10%, right? 10% on the health bonus, so down to 30 from 40.
Yeah.
Do either of you think that this might make Tyrannical weeks? How much do you think this brings them into line here?
I think it'll bring him more into line. I'm not sure exactly. Because like you do gain a lot of time in the dungeon by not fighting fortified trash, but everybody has to relearn cooldowns, so it might be a long time before we see the real impact of this nerf, because dungeons are quite different when all the trash dies faster and all the bosses take a little longer still.
I think that it's not even... I don't even think one of the biggest issues is the Tyrannical like nerf itself. I don't think it's going to cause any more problems. I think the problem is the bosses. Like Nalthor, Hakar, Zav, all of them summon like these ads. All of them shield themselves and have these problems where you have to like focus down an ad or like kill through a shield, and it's just like, all right, well, this is really problematic the longer the fight goes. And it's just the age-old Tyrannical issue of the fight doesn't just get 30% longer because it has 30% more health. It gets exponentially longer because it has 30% more health. And
right, even if there was no mechanic, even just if you're fighting a target dummy that gets 30% more health, the fight gains more than 30% longer because you're spending, like, you only have the same amount of cooldowns, right? Especially it gets longer whenever there is a shield phase or ads that get summoned, anything like that really slows you down further.
I similar to
it might make you...
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, good.
Okay, yeah, I was like, I'm interested to see, similar to Trell, like how it's going to actually feel, because a nerf from 40 to 30% is actually a pretty massive buff, and if you could kill trash fast enough to be able to kind of offset the time differential on some of these more problematic bosses, I think it could bring it more in line. I don't think it'll be like a great like set, but I do think it'll be more in line. Also, Tyrannical fixes really suck this season.
Like Tyrannical bosses that are really, really rough also affect the pulls before and after them too, because you got to hold more CDs, you got to worry about a lot of like just so many more factors going into the boss that you wouldn't normally have to deal with on Fortified. Like say Hakar, you need like every cooldown on demand to do Hakar on a high Tyrannical key, right? So you can't really blow everything on the Pride like you would before, and maybe the Pride is now the problem as well as the longer boss fight. So there's just so many things that Fortified versus Tyrannical changes in a dungeon.
And so even though you could actually do the stuff as well, you're losing so much efficiency as well by trying to actually make the bosses, actually completable. Well, I don't want to overstate or understate just how big this is, though. I mean, it's a quarter of the affix has been lopped off. That's quite a large impact.
It is very big, yeah.
Tettles, you
It's good to
mentioned
see.
that the other affixes that accompany Tyrannical are often more harsh. I think I'm inclined to agree with that.
Yes.
There's really not very many weeks. Like if you ignored this first row and you were just looking at the level 4 and level 7 rows, almost all of the best combinations are next to a fortified already. There's some stuff here. I think like Raging Quaking Tyrannical is one that looks like a pretty solid contender for playable week. Bursting Explosive, I think also probably up there. But a lot of this stuff that is next to Tyrannical, Bolstering Necrotic, Inspiring Necrotic, Bolstering Storming, those are...
It's all just like bolstering. It's shit that slows you down. You're like, all right, never mind. I can't play this anyways.
So there's 2 explosive weeks, Raging Explosive and Bursting Explosive, and then Raging Quaking. I think those are the 3 best Tyrannical contenders from the list.
I think that Raging one is probably pretty solid. The Raging Quaking one.
You guys want to do some 20s on Bolstering Necrotic Tyrannical?
Dude, what the fuck was that last week? That was actually so bad. It's actually just
one of those affixes out, and it would still be a hard week.
Yeah, this week, compare this to Fortified Bursting Volcanic. That is
yes, very fair.
This is like doing that's like doing Legion dungeons in our current gear versus doing Shadowlands dungeons.
It's
the difference.
I don't know. I mean, there was like really good push weeks during BFA on Tyrannical. There was that. It was Bursting Quaking, or was it Bursting Volcan? I don't know. There was like a really good Tyrannical week in BFA. Not exactly that many now anymore.
Teaming Volcanic.
Yeah, Teaming Volcanic.
Teaming Volcanic. That's what it was.
Yeah. Which was not bad, although it was
something
Tyrannical.
That was silly. Yeah.
All right, let's do the other stuff in this hotfix now, and then we're doing this in a slightly different order. But accompanying the Tyrannical nerf, we also had several nerfs to generally Tankbuster mobs, and how they bust your tanks have been reduced by quite a bit. So you have mobs like the Start of the Mechagon section and The Other Side, the Drust Soul Cleavers and Mists, the Chamber Sentinels in Sanguine Depths, and the Frenzied Ghouls, the Ether Divers, all these sorts of things, the Bone Carvers, where the Bone Carvers, actually, it's kind of unclear how big of a nerf this is, because it was being reduced by armor, and now it isn't. So even though it's this big 70% number, there's a good chance this is doing about the same damage as it was before.
That bleed was being reduced by armor?
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
That's really funny.
Dude, bleeds are wild. Bleeds have like no rule set. They just do something random.
Side note.
Any physical dot is supposed to ignore armor, but this one wasn't.
Yeah. Dude, Necrotic Wake actually just monumentally easier now after the changes to
last week's as well.
Every fucking mob got nerfed.
Which I think was good. It's just a tough balancing act for them to do, because with dungeons like Necrotic Wake and Plaguefall, where the dungeon does itself for you if you play it right, it's really hard to land a balance that scales with the key level and the group's coordination, as well as a dungeon that doesn't do that kind of stuff. We talked about that last week. In general, though, I think that their stated reasoning behind all these changes was, we've noticed tanks in Mythic Keystone dungeons feeling pressured to spend more time running away and less time actually tanking than we'd like. In an effort to address this, we are dialing back the tank damage of a number of dungeon denizens who've proven to be particularly painful, rather.
Dude, okay, so can you imagine if instead they just like they're like, yeah, every single dungeon and every single mob in all the dungeons now just does 10% less damage with white swings.
That would have been my preferred.
That would have been a better fix
way to do this. Yeah. Because I think it is just the intensity of the auto attacks that is really threatening.
And this is a classic Blizzard problem. Like, they identify a problem finally like this, and then they implement the wrong solution. The solution is to make all 6 tank classes able to do these dungeons, especially on 15, without having to kite. Like, that's where they should be every season, and how they have been every season up until now. Maybe not season 1 of BFA, but if you're a full mythic geared tank, you should definitely not have to kite in a 15. Like, let's all be honest, we agree with that, right?
Yeah, it's wild, because like, even as a fully mythic geared tank in a 15, like, there are pulls you have to kite in many dungeons. Yeah.
Well, yeah, there's a lot of bleed. I mean, there's like a decent amount of bleeds. There are mobs like the Gargons and the Bone
right, which were untouched in Halls of
Players.
Atonement, because I think that Halls of Atonement has such good completion numbers, but like, there are still 5 pulls you have to kite in that dungeon.
Yeah, I mean, for what it's worth, the Gargons too are like, the reason that they don't have anti-kites and like shit like that is they're made to be kited. I'm pretty sure those packs are like intended to be kited.
Maybe.
Maybe, yeah. But like even just normal pulls on the other side, I've seen fully geared Mythic Prot Warriors, for example, having to kite when they run out of shield block. It's like the amount of damage coming in from white swings should not outweigh the mitigation patterns of tanks in a 15. And I think myself and many other experienced Mythic Plus tank players, or just good tank players in general that are raiders, agree that the auto swings are just way more powerful than they've ever been.
And to be fair here, they have targeted several of
feedback.
those white swings, but it's only on these specific mobs. It's not like across the board, right? It's just like some mobs are doing less with their autos. But mostly it's the actual Tankbuster mechanics which have gotten nerfed.
Wretched Phlegm, which is the plague boar thing too, also got hit. It's not on that blue pest, but they came back like a few hours later. They're like, yeah, never mind. This also needs to be nerfed too.
I wonder if that was Squishy tweeted, I think, right after this list came out that those should be included.
Oh yeah, they should have been. That's like absolutely true. The Wretched Phlegm from the plague boars does way too much damage. They should have also probably hit the plague rocks, I think, but
yeah, I was thinking plague rocks as well. Plague rock is literally a mob that they had to like remove one from the dungeon because it was causing so many problems. Yeah,
2 of them.
Yeah. So
I forgot about that.
Yeah, these changes were good though. At least something was done. Like a lot of these tank busters were one-shotting even the all-powerful Demon Hunter, and other tanks they're just like killing twice and one-shot.
Yeah, anytime my last resort procs on my Demon Hunter, I'm just thinking, what were you supposed to do on this as a paladin?
Okay, what about after your last resort and your Sun King trinket? What about after both of those proc?
I AFK for 8 minutes. I tell my group, all right, look, we've had enough for a while. Go make yourself a coffee or whatever.
Break time.
I put up a break timer. We come back when they're ready again. I don't know of any Demon Hunters who do it any other way. Anyways, in addition to these changes, let's also, I guess, because this does tie in as well, we can talk a little bit about the class balancing changes that came in too. So several classes got hit with the old 5%er, the old 3%er. In a couple of cases, they made some PvP adjustments so these were PvE oriented changes, and then in like the Frost DK case, they didn't want to make them too OP in PvP, so they hit Chill Streak while buffing all abilities. Some specs in here, like our arms, for instance, is getting a little buff, but people are worried about being really good in PvP, so they there's a little PvP talent nerf, I guess, in there.
What's funny though? I find it so silly that like Arms and Fury are getting buffed too, because like you're still bringing one of those to every single fight, and then if you factor in how much value they get out of Battle Shout, it's like they're already doing like effectively an unreal amount of damage. But I think the problem with like buffs is the fact that it can be on tanks too.
Yeah, I mean this is just a problem where any spec is bringing like 3% of the raid's damage by having Battle Shout, by having Chaos Brand, by having Mystic Touch. Like, how do you make it so that, or how do you have a balanced system where multiple warriors can potentially be good when you are always required to bring one, right? Like that, it's so tough to balance around representation that way when there's 36 specs and 20 Mythic raid slots. One of those 20 slots is always going to a warrior, right? And so like, regardless of how much damage they're doing, there's always that one warrior in there. But you also want them to feel okay on the damage meters. But then if they're like good on the damage meters and good on and bring that buff, and then there's specs out there that are just like that, sad in the rain, feral druid or whatever, enhancement shaman, just looking in like, why do they get damage and buff?
Well, part of the problem too is that like Prot Warrior, at least for like Arms and Fury, is that like Prot Warrior, Vengeance, and Brewmaster also all bring the buffs that are necessities. And so basically, you're going to bring 2 buff tanks, and I mean this is the problem with the system, is you're going to bring 2 buff tanks and then pick the best out of those 3, like the best DPS out of those 3, and like infrequently are you going to stack them unless of course one of them is exceptionally strong.
Yeah, you basically have this checklist, and we talked about this in our episode with tags, where you go into the tier, right, and you have like, okay, we need 1 paladin for Devo Aura, we need 1 monk, we need 1 warrior, we need a warlock, obviously, we need a demon hunter, right? What are going to be the best ways to solve these problems, right? So rather than having like 20 raid slots that specs can compete for, there are several specs out there that are only competing for like one of 4 slots that's left over after you finish picking all the OP specs and all the specs that check those boxes.
And I also think it reduces tank diversity by a significant amount because of it too, because it kind of locks you straight into a comp for almost the whole tier. Like you're not gonna see like Blood DK or Prop Paladin that much because of this, right?
Guardian as well. Like Guardian, the fact that Boomkin gets Roar now basically kills Guardian's claim to being a tank that gets brought, right? Remember Kill Jaden, people brought Guardians because they had Stampeding Roar. Well, you get your Stampeding Roar from your Boomkins now. You don't need. There's no Feral or Guardian thing that gets brought. So it's tough when you have like 8 or 9 specs out of the 36 that bring something like that, and then 20 or so specs that are just sitting there with nothing, and there's so few spots left for them after. I don't know. I mean, I've talked about this before, but I think that this is not a good equilibrium that we're in right now.
I agree with that.
It's especially bad right now because Havoc and Arms and Fury have been slightly low on the damage meters, so it's like it really exaggerates the problem where Vengeance and Prot Warrior were like the go-to picks.
Now a lot of people,
Brewmaster's really squishy too, so like you want to Windwalker over it for sure, because also Windwalker does a ton of damage. A
lot of people look at the changes here, like the Havoc getting the 3% buff, and they're like, this doesn't solve the problem with the spec, right? The spec doesn't need any help in AoE, it just needs help on single target. I'm inclined to agree that like almost every spec, there are good ways to fix it that aren't just giving them aura buffs. But if you're going to do balancing like mid-patch, frequent balancing mid-patch, which people want, which I think I want, I think you got to accept that like, okay, look, between the patches, you're probably just going to see small percentage adjustments, right? And then during the patches, that's when you can come in and say, all right, look, we're changing some core functionality of how Blade Dance works, how the talent rows look.
I would argue this is a byproduct of like the implementation of like these aura buffs and nerfs, and like the implementation of the tuning knobs, like you said. It's like before, I feel like the developers were at least a little bit more willing to try to make active choices as to like address the problems of like where the spec is being lackluster, and to try to address like what is actually happening with the spec. But now they'll just hit you with the aura buff if they see your spec is underperforming, and it's just a band-aid to a much greater issue a lot of times. Granted, and for what it's worth, most people only care about damage though. So
I think though that I certainly am ready to describe these as band-aid fixes. But I think that Band-Aids are good to, if you've got a spec that's bleeding, slap a Band-Aid on it until you get to the next patch, right? It seems like a good solution to me until we get to a new patch. Rather than, there've been a lot of patches in WoW's history where just no balancing has come in at all, and this is the second or third round of these 3 to 5% adjustments that some specs have gotten, including some specs now getting hit multiple times. And I think that this is a really good way to make it so that it's less punishing to beat. Like it's not going to change which of these specs are the right and wrong specs to be playing if that's the kind of content you're doing where there is right and wrong specs. But it's going to make it a lot less hurtful to be one of the wrong specs, especially in the kinds of content where you're playing and you don't want to be choosing based on that, right? If you're in a guild where you just want to play Survival Hunter and that's the spec you enjoy, it's really nice to see your numbers get tuned up, and it's not necessarily going to fix all the problems with the spec or anything, but it makes it less bad to be on that. It makes it less of a bad experience in Raid when you're just sitting at the bottom of the meters every night, right? So I think that Band-Aids are a frequent Band-Aids between patches. People are comparing that with like perfect adjustments to spells, but what they should be comparing it with is nothing, because I think that's the alternative, is if we'd either get this or nothing. I think this is a lot better.
Take what we can get.
Yeah, that's true.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about the MDI, because we have that coming up this weekend as well, and then we will do tip of the week, and then we'll do our main topic. So we're chugging along here. MDI is happening, so we've got the Global Cup 2 this coming weekend, where we have, fortunately, 8 teams that have completed all 3 time trial dungeons, which is very good news for me and Talos. I was a little worried that we weren't going to get there, but last second, we do have an 8th team showing up here, which is good. So here's those leaderboards, where we've got, there's quite a bit more. If you compare this, there's been several teams now that have dropped out or are no longer competing that had pretty good times in the last go around, like the question mark squad. You may remember them, aren't in anymore.
Trell's team.
Yeah, Trell's team. Several of the like 9th through 13th place teams not going again. Pieces, who qualified but then couldn't compete in the first cup, also not going again. But these top 7 teams were all in last weekend and have all queued again. So yeah, that's the situation we're looking at. Tattles, how do you want to start MDI discussion?
Okay, what is wrong with like MDI qualifiers right now? Because this is like historically low compared to what we've even seen in the past, and I'm not actually sure what the problem is anymore. Is it time trials? Like,
so, I mean, Trial can speak to the time commitment part of practice as well, right? The fact that there's a long time trial window. I think one thing that is potentially worth considering is whether there needs to be a qualification period for each cup at this point. I think that instead something like a qualification period, even / larger, more open tournament, and then a season of the 8 teams that qualified for the whole season would maybe be a better way to approach it. I'm not sure.
Oh, okay. So my thoughts on it are, and Charlie, you can tell me why this is stupid because you have more experience with at least qualifying than I do in more recent seasons. I think that the time trials should be on Friday, and they should do like some like weird ass time trial format to be able to field the top 6 teams, not 8. So that way, then we could go into Saturday and Sunday with the exact same number of broadcast days, and we'll do like a broadcast session on Friday where we're going over the time trials, like even in real time, if they want to still separate the time trials out over 3 days. And then we just go Saturday, Sunday with main broadcast with the top 6 teams. I feel like that would be a little bit more reasonable. And it's like less practice time, potentially even no practice time, but they get like, I don't know, 5 or 6 hours on Friday to be able to slam through all their time trials. And then just like they take the top 6 teams and go into the weekend. I feel like that would at least be a little bit more reasonable.
Well, the only problem with that is I like the short amount of time for time trials. I think that's good. Instead of 5 days just about of time trials where people are incentivized to spend 24 hours every single day as long as they can practicing. That part's good. I don't know about the no practice time for the cup though. I think cups should have a day or 2.
It's tough, right? Because anytime you try and enforce like a no practice time thing, the closer you get to 0 practice time, the more you kind of require teams to then be practicing just indefinitely beforehand for all the possible things they might get, right?
Yeah.
So there's kind of this sweet spot where you want like enough practice time that teams feel like they can do some work and be efficient in it, but not so much that it's an overwhelming amount of time. It's a really difficult balance to strike.
It's so hard to say what should be changed because this is really common. The format's very similar to how it's been for years.
It's a very common
going downhill.
Like angst among a lot of competitors, casters, organizers. There's a lot of people that look at it and are like, okay, something needs to change, but we don't know. It's hard to say precisely what it needs to be.
Part of the problem too is that the viewership isn't bad and people seem to be enjoying watching the MDI. The competitors are not having a fun time competing though. And sure, it could be alleviated by money, right? Like obviously you could throw a bunch of money at it and it would solve the issue, right? But I don't think that's like the real crux
the money per viewership is in a pretty good place right now compared to other esports as well. Like the amount of money that's coming in per viewer. I don't know, it's tough, right? Because you have these competing pulls of like, how do you make it more exciting for viewers? How do you make it more good for the players? And those are often 2 things that are pulling in very different directions, right? Like viewers would love like a pick ban phase with like wacky comps and different dungeons with players, total clown fiesta runs, right? And players would really rather not, be in that kind of situation.
I think that they should also change like how it's being done. I don't think that you speed run only across 18s is like the real way to do it anymore. I think that you probably need people to, I think laddering up would be like going from like a 16 to a 20 would be at least more interesting. And honestly, it would allow teams that aren't practicing MDI as much. They
literally, they've done that twice before where like you remember when the finals was a higher key level than the rest of the tournament? Do you remember in like Legion when it went from like 20s to 22s to 24s, and the players did not like that. They hated that.
I didn't mean laddering up like that. I mean, it's an open tournament.
Oh, okay. I mean,
teams run simultaneously.
Like, okay, so
Oh,
instead
like
of two teams
speedrunning
playing
how-
against
how
each
high
other,
you
it's
can
like
get.
the entire
Yes.
team plays on the same map.
Yes.
Yeah, it's tough
That
though
would be
because like
cool.
that has a lot of
Not-
broadcast challenges, right? Like you need now 8 observers instead of or 16
Yeah.
observers instead of 4.
That's
and
true.
a bunch of extra feeds and stuff. I don't know. It's
It's. I mean, I think that something needs to change, though. I think that it being stagnant is not going to
Yeah.
be great.
I think
It'll
that
be interesting.
it was really tough to identify things that have the best like bang for your buck in terms of things you could change that would improve the situation. I do think that one thing that the MDI is doing really well right now is that level of competition among really the top 2, but even the top 4 or 5 teams is in a really good place right now, I think. The quality of those games has been phenomenally good. The amount of close games there were last cup, and I expect there will be this cup, particularly between Echo and Perplexed, but also maybe with the new Golden Guardians team, with all those kind of 3 through 6 teams, has been really good. And there were a lot of upsets, which historically I think a big problem with the MDI was there were several cups where the higher seeded team, the better seeded team, won every single game.
Won every single one. Yeah.
And I think that this time around, that not happening is pretty good for viewership. So,
dude, okay.
I'm not sure.
So I watched some of the Legion MDI matches on stream the other day, and I actually had so much fun watching them. I didn't realize why the Legion MDI was fun to watch, but it was fun to watch because every game was a fucking fiesta. And there was I thought that the Chinese team that got stuck on Rockamora happened during the regional qualifier. That was during the fucking global finals that they got.
Is it really?
The Rockamora.
Yes,
Yeah.
Fuck is that? And it's just like I think that was what made Legion MDI so much more fun, is that literally every team and every single match was such a goddamn fiesta. It made it a lot more enjoyable to play and enjoyable to watch.
It's tough, right? Because you can't
also-
really put that genie back in the bottle, right?
I agree. Yeah.
Yeah.
Good job.
Just the novelty of it was so nice, and everyone was so excited. And it was also new. There weren't any set in stone teams like the top 3 or 4 teams we have now that are like, you look at those teams as a new group trying to do the MDI, and you're like, all right, well, we're not going to beat them. Maybe we can try to get 5th place, and is that even worth it? That's one of the problems of teams trying to do MDI is that mindset.
Yeah.
It makes it worse that both regions are combined because there's not going to be a lot of new teams that can just roll in and compete with them right off the bat. The skill set for MDI is so different from live that you have to build it with the same group of people over time, only doing MDI, and nothing else really contributes to that. And the other problem is that I think needs to change immediately is the time trials. The time trials need to not be 4 or 5 days. They need to be 2 days at the max. And every single person that's competed in the MDI agrees with that. So
Yeah.
I think they are going to change that or something like it.
I agree that's like the biggest, easiest and biggest problem to solve, like in terms of efficiency of,
But I mean,
of solving problems. That one would
Even
be the
then,
best.
teams aren't posting time trials, like posting time trial times at all. There was like only 12 teams that even posted a run, right?
Well, but it's still the
Yeah.
the decision to try and compete versus not is made based on the fact that to be competitive you need to use those 5 days, right?
This season of MDI is just like the perfect storm of bad things happening. Like
It's
time
also
trials.
good raid.
Yes, yeah. It was released during a point in time where most of the Hall of Fame guilds were still proroguing on like the last 3 bosses. And so my team, for example, lost like 12 hours of practice time to 4 different raid nights during the first time trials. And then I also had my surgery, so we lost that, but that was irrelevant for the discussion.
Right, that's not a
Yeah.
Blizzard can't control when players' appendixes explode, but they can control
Yeah.
when the raid schedule is and stuff.
We had the raid release. This season also is the new target cap season, and then it's like no fun for MDI competitors compared to previous MDIs. Like previous MDIs, you could roll into a key with 4 or 5 classes that do big AoE damage and just like experiment and have fun. This time there are like 2 classes that do good AoE damage. So you just have one person play that class, and the other 2 people don't get a chance to really do big damage. And that's like a big part of the enjoyment of MDI is the big pulls, which are still happening, by the way, Blizzard. Even though you tried to target cap, people are still going to do big pulls. And then also, they extended the time trials to start on Friday, which locks out anybody that works on Friday.
So I think you've identified a couple of different things there, some of which are just on the game dev end, where I agree there's a lot of work that has been done that, regardless of the impact it might have had on plus 15s, which I still argue that the target cap hasn't has been neutral at best and negative, I think, for even there.
For most people,
Yeah.
yeah. I think it also becomes like you become really bitter over those specs that aren't targeted. Like, I think people have real animosity towards fire mages right now because they're not target kept. Like
fire mage has been
so
just
fucking salty.
Fire mage is also like they're coming off of Nyalotha as well, right? Fire mages were just like the most broken spec in the game before, and now they're for 2 patches in a row they're just like clowning on people.
I mean, dude, people are bitter about wild spirits too, though.
Yeah, I mean it's that's the problem with a target cap that's applied unevenly and at different numbers for different specs. Is that it's just, I mean it's bad. I don't know, so I think that it's tough because when you look at the MDI, there's a lot of solution like knee-jerk solutions that get proposed from just like borrowing from other esports, but there's not really any other esport that's like it, right? Competitive speedrunning is not something that you see as an esport anywhere else, really. There's not really any direct analogs. The closest thing would be like track and field, running around in a like IRL, that kind of stuff. Tour de France, even those sorts of time based, against an environment.
I mean, most of the time it's like an event, right? It's like oh god, what was that Super Mario 64 one that they did at the beginning of 2020?
There's like GDQ,
like awesome,
yeah,
there's awesome games on Quick,
GDQ, all those. But those are done. Those are like one-off events where it's a lot less about the competition. It's more just like
exactly
the Olympics,
bringing up the against the environment part. Whereas here, it's really trying to make a PvP thing out of a PvE format. And there's not really other PvE esports of this type.
There was one for like Mario 64, but I mean, it's an event, not an esport, right? It's
right.
Like it's a one-off event. It's like turning the Race to World First from an event into an esport, and it's not going to be like there's.
Yeah, if you tried to have weekly Race to World First type competitions between teams, there's a whole host of challenges that get out of there. I do think one thing that to look forward to though is there are going to be several like one-off weekend MDI experiments over the next while that I think are gonna try and break new ground and see how things feel with different format ideas, different structures.
So, that should be good. I hope that they pull out some like wild shit and you're just like, and they look at the MDI and they're like, maybe this is a better format for us.
Yeah, because I think that
I could see it being like a 1 week per season event where it's like the Race to World First and everyone just pushes as high as they can at an open bracket like we were talking about earlier. But it's not like every 2 weeks they do the same thing. They just do it once per season, I think that'd actually be pretty cool.
Yeah, that was kind of our push week thing. We're kind of trying to proof of concept that sort of coverage.
Our day rate would be a lot better than the race than our push week event.
Well, yeah, I mean that was not monetized in the slightest, which
shit, hold on, now that I'm really thinking about it.
Copyright it quick.
There's a strong argument we were losing a substantial amount of money doing that. But whatever. It's fun. I think that it was popular as well, which is cool.
Yeah.
That would be a lot more relatable to live players as well. Like the MDI is just so foreign to live players. That's also one of the big problems I don't think we mentioned yet. If you're a new player to the game, or if you like Mythic Plus and you see the MDI, you can't really go replicate anything because everyone's Night Elf, everyone has perfect classes, perfect gear, perfect conduits, everything. But you don't have the access to like any of that on live, and also you just don't have the access to practicing the key. You have to just do it once and play it safe.
Dude,
so it's so foreign.
I'm glad that Echo's streaming.
Yeah, that was really cool. That was really cool to see. I'm rooting for them this weekend because I want the team that streamed to be rewarded. I want that to become a thing. One of the most heartbreaking things for me about the MDI, actually, this is something that I thought the MDI was really cool to see, was the Covenant stuff. Last Cup, we saw like 4 different Covenants of Priest, including like one player who played 3 of 4 different Covenants of Priest, 2 different Covenants for most of the other specs we saw, like besides Fire Mage and Hunter, actually even Hunter, besides like Fire Mage, I think we saw every other spec that got represented had multiple different Covenants that people were playing.
Weren't they?
Who was?
Wasn't Windwalker just Kyrian?
Oh yeah, Windwalker was also just Kyrian. And obviously Mage was just Fae, but every other spec that showed up had multiple different Covenants being represented. And for me, the most heartbreaking thing is I think that would be so cool to bring that from the MDI to the live servers. that like experience of choosing which priest covenant, which vengeance DH covenant you're going to play in each dungeon based on those strengths and weaknesses was such an exciting thing to think about, and I wish that was
God,
in the game.
Vanos, you're so smart. Swapping covenants is such a great thing. I don't know why it's not.
It was just so cool to see, especially when like good players disagreed about which, like, if you think about how difficult a task it was to land the covenant balancing in a pretty close band, you know, compare it to the specs, right? We saw very little drift in the specs between the teams. So obviously there was some, but mostly teams were playing the same 5 specs, but they were often making 3 different covenant choices across those 5 specs as the other team. So the balancing was actually so close that even in an MDI setting where there's really hyper intense pressure on picking the very best by a small percentage point, people were coming up with different answers. Imagine if we got to make those choices when actually playing the actual game as well. It'd be so cool.
That's another reason why it's so foreign.
So that's my bit. Make covenant swappable, please. Let's move on to the rest of our show. So before we go on to talking about tank kiting as our strategy session this week, we get to do our tip of the week segment. My tip of the week is that the Great Vault, you may be surprised to get a keystone of a higher level than you were expecting out of your Great Vault, because it seems like it's calculated based off of your highest run of the season rather than just looking at last week's now. So if anybody's been wondering why they've been getting higher keys than they thought they would be getting out of their Great Vault, I think it's just looking at what is the highest key you've done all season rather than what is the highest key you did last week.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Okay, shit, that makes more sense now. Okay.
Which
so
is
it's
cool.
So if you have a 21, or if you have a 21 done, it will always give you.
It's
a
just
20.
gonna poop out 20s every week, I think. Again, I've heard some slightly conflicting if evidence on this. I haven't been able to thoroughly test it, obviously, but this is what it looks like it's doing to me right now. So
yeah, same here.
Yeah,
they definitely changed something.
If anybody knows the actual algorithm, if it's different than that, do let me know. But that's my belief on how it works.
That's cool.
All right, Trell, what is your tip of the week?
Mine has to do with a specific Mythic Plus mechanic. So there's these guys called Putrid Butchers in the Theater of Pain. And they try to cast Devour Flesh on the tank, which does a lot of damage and also heals the mob for quite a bit if it goes off. And right now, with the meta being Vengeance Demon Hunters pretty much only and high keys, they don't have any tools to stop that cast. So the rest of the party actually needs to be aware of Devour Flesh and stun it in some way. You can't knock it, you actually have to stun it or disorient it to prevent it.
You can range this. I believe you can leap away from this, and it will also work to stop it.
Oh, really?
You can misery it if you're like 7,000 IQ.
Okay.
No, it's undead. It's undead. You can't
misery that.
Yeah, that's
I lied. I just made that up.
So dumb.
Vengeance Demon. Yeah, I guess leaping away, if that works, that's the only way you can do it.
I think I've leapt this. I can't 100% prove it, but I believe I've outranged it. But yeah, that's really good to do because it is such a big heal. That slows down the pull a lot. Very good tip. And Tettles now, we will look at your clip of the week, which comes from Gingy during MDI time. So what has happened here?
So they've pulled Moizala, and they have the Enraged Spirit up, and he's like invis because he doesn't really want to pull the Enraged Spirit, and he's walking away from the boss. And if you don't walk away from the boss fast enough, whenever it instead of taking the portal, the obvious other solution would be to walk away. But you have to walk way faster than what he's doing. He dies to the instant one shot from the boss.
Okay, so this is the Shatter reality cast. He didn't get far enough away from it when reality was being shattered. That's why you got to take those portals, I guess. That's why you got to get out of there. Okay.
Luckily, it looks like practice mode was on, so that was not a real attempt.
Yes. That's a good thing to do. Is that actually going to be a thing? Are we going to see those Enraged Spirits skipped into the other side now? Because that seems sketch. That seems sketch given that they patrol on those platforms.
Very sketchy. I think that I don't know if they ended up being able to do it consistently, but I know that they tooled around with it a decent amount during
That's
their
so cool.
runs.
That is some of the stuff that's really cool to see from MDI practice is even if by the time of the weekend teams end up looking pretty similar in routes, there's all kinds of cool stuff they try, and it's nice. It's actually really, really awesome that Echo streamed, and we got to see that from them.
You know, I bet they could skip the enraged spirits, because even if they pulled them like a little late during the time they kill their ads, they could just shadow meld as soon as they get back to the middle, and it should be fine. I think in theory.
Yeah, problem is they're probably going to murder. They're probably going to murder him if he's on the platform. I guess it depends on where he is in the patrol. Maybe if you could.
Depends on who it is.
Yeah. But you always can just assign Gingy to go to the platform with the enraged spirit, right?
Well, I mean, yeah, if you have like a hunter or a mage there, they actually can just like block turtle whatever during the rage cast if they have it off. And then like they have to obviously cancel block or turtle before they get picked up, but that's basically it, right? And then they meld later.
But you also got to do a lot of damage to the actual Mwizala image, right?
Well, he'll meld it off later, right?
Right,
assuming that the healer's not getting combat.
You have a pretty tight DPS check, even on Fortified, which I think it is in that dungeon this week.
Yeah,
maybe.
I think it's just sitting turtle or ice block, right?
And you also need to avoid getting autoed, right?
I suspect that you could probably just combust him and he dies, but maybe that's not true.
We'll have to find out this weekend when Echo plays in the MDI.
YouTube.com/Warcraft.
Very cool. Let's move on to our main topic, which is kiting as a tank. This is somewhat inspired by the fact that there was this huge hotfix designed to make this less important, but I believe it still will be important, and I think it's just good to know how to kite as a tank, and how to help your tanks kite as a non-tank in dungeons. So I think part of this, it comes with planning as well, is just looking at a pull and identifying before you need to start kiting that you are going to need to kite. And this is a really tricky one for a lot of tanks will go in, they'll pop a lot of defensives, and then they'll kind of run out of defensives, and then they'll realize that they were supposed to start kiting 5 seconds ago, and then they'll die. So trying to think 5 or so seconds ahead, trying to figure out, okay, how long am I going to have sufficient defensives to stay alive in this pull? And then if that's not going to last as long as the whole pull is, I need to get out 2 seconds before all my defensives fall off, right? And start getting out of there. I think is a very important step 0 for doing a good kite.
Okay, so obviously getting out of the pack is really important, but like, what do you do if you're not like a Vengeance Demon Hunter with Infernal Strike? Because obviously Vengeance has it. Vengeance and Brewmaster Monk are probably the easiest, since they have like roll/Chi Torpedo and Infernal Strike to be able to just like effectively infinite mobility, right? But
they can do it themselves. However, every tank has a way of doing it. They usually need help from their group in some way. Like Warrior can either leap out, or they can charge to a preset healer or ranged DPS that they communicate with before. Bear can put down a Vortex if they're Resto Affinity, or typing the mobs away from them and then start moving out if they're Bounce Affinity. Paladin can horse away, but that's their only.
they can play
horse away, get melee to the back and die while they're running away.
There's some talent choices you're going to want to make as a paladin if you're planning to kite. You can make Slowy Consecration that will help you as well, and you can if you want to keep your threat, you can take Blessed Hammer so that you can keep doing actual damaging globals while you're kiting and avoid losing threat just as much. And that means you can actually kite a little earlier on paladin than you can on a lot of other specs, because so many of your globals continue to do effective damage while you're kiting. But
Paladin's actually pretty good at kiting once they get out, because they can use so many ranged attacks to keep throwing the mobs with Consecration, Shield of the Righteous,
Avenger Shield, a huge one.
Avenger Shield, what I meant to say, yeah.
And then DK, just Death and Decay, and walk away from the mobs.
Yeah, so Grip of the Dead.
The Grip of the Dead talent is a 90% slow. You got to use that really well to get out, or communicate with your group with a stun.
Mass Grip as well can be used as often. Mass Grip is not used to facilitate kiting, but it can be. It is really potent for, you can just Mass Grip onto the farthest back mob or onto a DPS player and then run away. Any of that stuff can potentially work. So yeah, having a kind of awareness of what parts of your toolkit help you start the kite can be really valuable. Also, just stuff like AoE stuns, leg sweep, shockwave, or coming from your group. AoE stuns coming from your group can be the start of your kite as well.
Yeah.
Any of that kind of stuff can be really effective. You really want to make sure you avoid showing the mobs your back when you're close to them, obviously, because then you will get autoed in the back, and those are much more lethal than autos in the front for most tank specs. So
it's actually a really good point. That becomes second nature eventually, but when you're first learning how to kite, you want to spin your camera around without turning your character, and then leap backwards or something. Or strafe away from the mob sideways instead of just going straight backward and risking getting one shot.
Yeah.
But after a while, it becomes second nature. Like you always just want to face the mobs no matter what.
So when do you guys use externals normally? Is it whenever you start your kite? Is it whenever you enter a pack? What exactly is like a general rule of like when to get an external? Like obviously, Wrestle Shaman is meta, so fewer externals normally. But like, what is like a general rule of thumb for those?
Well, you definitely don't want to use it when you start your kite because that kind of wastes the external. Because even if you're a Brewmaster monk, an external does not prevent stagger damage. So you have to prevent the first instance of damage that hits you. So usually you want to use things like that are outside of your control on like a early basis. So as soon as you go into a pull, call for bark or sack or PI, paint suppression, PS.
Call for
PI. Call for PI. Your DPS will love it. Yeah.
PI the tank so he can fracture more.
Yes.
More threat. Thanks. But, so you want to use the external first, so you have all of your own tools to use at the right instant that you need them. Because when you call for an external, you typically need to wait like 1 or 2 seconds for the latency of asking someone across the world to do something for you. Yeah. And then you use your own stuff after that.
There's the couple seconds for them to hear, and then there's the couple seconds depending on who you're playing with for it to go through their brain, whether or not they actually want to cast it on you. I think, yeah, using externals early, it does depend a little bit on what spec you're playing. There are a lot of specs that are especially squishy on pull. So stuff like Guardian Druid, for instance, when you don't have your Iron Furs up on pull, and so if you want to use you basically have to use a cooldown either from yourself or somebody else on pull if you want to avoid just getting killed by the first 3 auto attacks of any given pull. So we saw this in, remember when Dorky was playing Bear a lot at the end of BFA, a lot of it was like bark me on pull every pull, right? As the first global going into each combat was the strategy there. Whereas some specs, Prot Warrior, if you're going in with Avatar and Shield block up, you probably wait for those things to be over before you call for the paint suppression or whatever, the bark.
Right, exactly. Yeah, it's different for every tank, but like the general guidelines is like use your external first, sometimes even with your own defensive, and then use your own defensives or kiting utility after that. Usually when I play a slightly more immobile tank like a Bear, when I start kiting, I call for Binding Shot first if I have a Hunter, because it's the most consistent way to just get out of the pack and instantly stop getting meleeed. Like if you call for a Ring, for example, as the first kiting tool from another player, then sometimes it'll take a little bit because they're casting Fist of Fury or something, and it won't immediately get the mobs off you. You kind of just have to wait.
Yeah, I think also one factor to consider is how to make your kite as less costly as possible for your damage dealers, right? So something like Binding Shot is really good at keeping the mobs packed up, usually in the same AoE effects that they already were in, and in a predictable spot for the next AoE. Oftentimes, if you're kiting, particularly if you're kiting packs that include some casters, some archers, that kind of stuff, that can really cause the group to get all spread out. And that can really hurt your group's damage, which means you have to kite for longer, which means the kite might not be as successful. And whether you die or not, you're costing more time on a kite like that. So thinking about how you can use your abilities to keep things grouped up for your DPS players and ideally keep them in the same spot for 10-second bursts is really good. So something like this, something that people don't think about is like, should you be line of sighting this kite while you're kiting it, or should you be staying in line of sight? Sometimes you want to make sure that you line of sight so that the archers actually run with the pack, right? Sometimes you want to stay in line of sight, and then that way if the front mobs have a cast or something, they'll start casting on you, and that'll let everything group back up. Those all can be important considerations that aren't so much about the survivability of the kite, but are just about making sure that the mobs stay nice and tightly packed.
Yeah, that's a good point. And the group gains so much damage by the mobs being stacked. For one, all the ground effects stay on the mobs. And 2, they don't have to worry about where all the mobs are and like who has threat, who's going to get hit by what. They can all see the mobs in one spot on their screen, so nobody has to think too hard about it. And 3, it's easier for the tank to keep threat on all the mobs if they're all in one place. So it's like beneficial in so many different ways that it subtly increases the DPS of the group by like exponential amounts that you wouldn't normally just be able to see.
And I mean, that's the importance of like displacements, slows, and stuns to be able to keep the mobs just like grouped up more. Like if you're playing with a warlock that has like Sacrolash on and you're kiting a bunch, I bet the damage differential across the whole entire group is just like infinitely higher than if he wasn't playing Sacrolash, for example, right? Or like if you have Ursul's Vortex and you're using it proactively, it just like saves you a lot of time and damage. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, I think that's a great consideration to make as well. What about going back in? Trell, what is your belief system on when is it safe to go back in after you've decided to start kiting?
You know, honestly, most of the time in Mythic Plus seasons, you reach a point where you just don't go back into the pole once you start kiting because it's so dangerous. Because you usually have to, once keys get high enough, or some poles even on like 15 to 16 are super hard, where you got to use several defensives on pole. Sorry, my cat's going crazy.
Tells
And
us
then
too.
as soon as your defensives are done, you kite for the rest of the pole because you just can't live without your base mitigation plus a major defensive and a second defensive. So like the common strategy there on those kinds of poles is to run in for literally 4 to 5 globals and that's it with your huge defensives running. Do as much damage as you can for threat, and then you run out with some utility, someone stuns or something, ring a piece, binding shot, Ursula's, and then you run in circles around the pack for the rest of the time it's alive so that it's all
throwing
in
your
the same area.
throwing your ranged abilities at them or whatever.
Yeah,
Yeah.
sometimes you're sort of like mini kiting where you're still somewhat in melee and you're still taking some autos, but you're like trying to 80% of the time be out of range of any given auto attack.
Do you want to explain like circling the mobs trail, like circle kiting, where it's like you're not getting melee by the full pack? Because we haven't seen that in a while.
So like areas where there's a big area, which isn't a lot of dungeons, this X pack, unfortunately. But like if you think of the first pull of Toldagor, last expansion, that's like the recipe for kiting pulls. Like you go in for a couple seconds, you get out, and then you run in huge circles around the entire pack so that the whole pack stays within like a flame patch, a tar trap, something with a kind of radius on the ground so that people can do all their damage predictably.
Yeah, that's a good way to make the most use of the space you have. Absolutely. Okay, how does the rest of the group help the tank kite is, I think, an important question as well. Depending on what group you're playing with, kiting can be made a lot easier or harder, depending on what's going on. So I think one underrated thing to think about is threat as well. Threat is a huge part of what makes a kite successful. So using abilities like misdirection and tricks is actually one of the best ways that you can help your tank kite on a big pull like that. So I think that's one thing I want to call attention to immediately.
Or
other than that,
you could just have Kyrian Sigil and drop it from range and do all of the damage.
That's a good one too. Yeah, having range damage obviously helps as the tank. It's, I think, important though, especially if you are playing with a tank that isn't Avenged Demon Hunter. You know, that helping them in that initial stage where Avenged Demon Hunter would Infernal Strike, helping them create that initial distance using stuff like Typhoon, like an AoE stun to allow the tank to then make that first little bit of distance, I think can be a really important way to help as a group, as a member of the group.
Yeah, definitely. I think a big thing if you're just learning how to kite as a group or as a tank player, or if you're trying to help your tank learn how to kite, is marking the tank so that the group knows where they are at all times. That's pretty important as well. And once you see their marks start to move a certain direction, then the whole party should know like that's where they're going to go for the first part of their kite.
I think one of the I was gonna say. Sorry. I was gonna say I think another huge thing is maintaining kicks from ranged, like making sure like because the tank will oftentimes like facilitate the most important kicks in the pack, but like once he's out of the pack, he's not normally able to get his kick too. So making sure that you're continuously kicking is also really important.
Yeah, I think another thing you learn as well when you start kiting is like what weird stuff happens when this mob is being kited, right? Is it going to do a frontal aimed at the tank? Is it going to do a frontal aimed at the closest player? Is it going to do a targeted ability on the closest player now that the tank is out of range? Is it going to delay a certain ability until it is within range of the tank again? All of these different behaviors happen on different mobs, and so it's kind of something that you need to learn on a mob-by-mob basis, but my base assumption would be the entire pull is way more dangerous while it is being kited. There's way more stuff that can potentially kill you as a DPS player if you're standing next to it. So just be on the lookout for stuff going in weird directions that you need to watch out for while the tank isn't there. And then, of course, learn each mob's little bit as much as you can. In some cases, there's mobs that really incentivize you to not kite, but you'll find ways to kite them anyway. Stuff like trees can be used against a lot of stuff that is an anti-kite mechanic. Really effectively. So if you're playing with a balance druid, those the trees are just really good for kiting anyways, because you can use them for 10 extra seconds of making threat on pull. You can do all kinds of good stuff with trees, keeping stuff in AoE while the kite is going on. All of that really, really valuable. So always talent that if you're in any kind of key where the tank is going to kite ever.
Something we should mention about kiting is that sometimes there's situations as a tank where you don't need to fully kite, but you should still get out of range of most of the mobs. And I mean, holes where there's a lieutenant mob that can't be kited, but there's also lots of smaller mobs that hurt quite a bit. So you can use stuff like Binding Shot to group all the mobs up right behind the lieutenant mob, so only the big mob is swinging at you at one point, and not 10 mobs at the same time. So you're taking like 1/10 of the damage, but everyone is still doing full damage.
You know, it's funny. That's actually really important for Inspiring. So Inspiring Presence works a little bit different than Emissary of the Tides. Like Inspiring, whenever it walks back into a pack, it won't like completely break all the CC off the targets. The mobs will remain CC during the duration of it. So you can use things like Binding Shot and like trees. And then whenever the Inspired mob comes back into the pack, the mobs will remain on those trees or on that Binding Shot as well. So it does allow for some more kiting in a different way as well.
That's very good. Very good little nuance that matters. I think that's one of the things that most comes up with kiting is that you really do have to pay attention to all those little nuances of how the different stuff behaves. And in some cases, kiting can just be worse than staying in as well as an important thing to be aware of. Like sometimes if you've got a bleed or a dot on you, and if you start to kite and you're like going to range your healer or line your healer, there's often times where you're less tanky kiting than you are just staying in and building resources and using defensive abilities. And I think that is an important thing to be aware of. On some packs, it's not going to work out if you start kiting until the very end of the pull. So you got to try and save your defensive cooldowns for those packs. That can mean that maybe the pull before those pulls, you kite earlier than you otherwise would because you don't want to fire off your Fell Devastation or whatever that lets you stay in, and you use it on pull on the next pull instead.
Yeah, that's actually a good point. There's so many points in time while you learn dungeons that you're gonna have to outrange your healer until you're on the same page with them and you play together a ton, so they know like what you'll do in each situation. But you have to choose sometimes if you're gonna die to a bleed or outrange your healer, and that's like the worst choice because usually you're gonna die either way. But maybe if you kite, that'll lead to further progression in the group because then your healer will know where you'd go next time.
Yeah, I think that that, you know, as much as you can communicate that you're going to kite before you start kiting, if you're playing with a healer that you haven't played with much before, that's definitely just a huge part of the tank healer synergy. And this expansion is so punishing because it is so important to kite. So you often are in that spot where if your healer's not ready for you to kite, you don't have a way that you live either way.
Yeah, and also like if the pack only has, I don't know, 10 seconds left, and you start to kite, you can actually slow down like group damage and make the pack go from like 10 to 20 seconds too. So like if the pack is like very close to dying, you may just want to try to man up and like use even like just call for a little bit more healing to be able to get through the last few seconds where you would have like a lapse in mitigation or be kind of scared.
Yeah, there is a often unknown external just saying heal me. Sometimes your healer is just not spending a gold, but maybe they're casting Lava Burst or something crazy like that, and you need to cast Healing Surges on you. And so
sometimes when you say heal me, you suddenly get a buff that you just like get healed 20% more.
It happens sometimes. I mean, just making your healer aware, because like healers don't always know. Sometimes the tank is at 80% health and they're like dead next global, and sometimes the tank is at 80% health and they're going to be at 75% health next global, right? And like a good healer can sometimes tell the difference there, but oftentimes there's a lot of different factors that a tank is much more aware of than the healer is of what their life total is looking like, and you know how much incoming damage they're about to take. So passing that information along to your healer, making them aware of when there's going to need to be like 30 healing surges in the next 30 globals on you. Like there's a lot of healers that will be able to keep you up through that if they know they have to, and so making them aware of it can really help. All right, anything we missed about kiting here? There's a pretty good information dump there.
I think that's a pretty good summary of it. Like, there's no way to explain how to take care of every single pack with kiting because, like we said, every mob's different. Every mob behaves differently. They have different move speeds. They cast sometimes. They are archer mobs sometimes. There's so many factors. So just learn the mobs in general and then how to kite them if possible. And then that's how you have to approach each individual pull.
Yeah, and I think as like somebody who's supporting a group that's kiting it, whether it be the healer or the tank, utilizing your utility, not necessarily even just like utilizing your utility to help them get away from the pack and make distance from the pack is normally going to be your best bet.
All right, let's move on to the Q&A segment, but first we get to thank our supporters over on the Patreon. They are Paul of US Proudmore, Soulbinds are just an underdeveloped dating simulator, Fukin in de Kukin. God, I hope I didn't say something bad.
Oh, you got a lot more non-English ones in a second.
All right. Delete DH. Deleting every layer 8 Torghast elegantly doing homework. Gopher. Hi, I'm Mac and I'm a balanced druid reroll because melee is cursed this tier. King of Skills. Zuko. Ja. I wish I was Ratnos' Dino Pillow. Chromed. Trekkie. The Marsh Hare. Regulus. Never Nude. Chewy. Tettles. AKA the espionage trying to learn EU's secrets. ZivXX, Sinara, Breadceratops, Necris, Revdil, Nevuk, Sinmora, Eevee, Frosty K new meta. Frosty K got buffed. Maybe it's time.
True.
Stevenson, an unnamed benefactor. Take Light of the Protector and Frenzied Regen off the GCD. Woebone Xenoverse, No Trick. I scheduled a Tettle's Flame. Sire Dematicus. GME, or Guardians Moonfiring Everything. Dymat, Syncope, Gamer Dad in Training. 45, Supra, Lufer, I guess I'm a DH main at heart. Hanny is going to pump in Shadowlands. Drilling in the Kukin. Flick. Kukin der Cookies. Gallic. Brusive. Chewy. Dratnos Abyss. Massive Spell God X. Dabrowski, M-Sanity. Please let my Survival Hunter have a raid spot, also buffed. Rerolling Shaman to avoid having to get a Lust Pet, PogChamp, also buffed for enhancement.
True.
Canyon and Moon Sinara of Emerald Dream Division 7 and Area 52 Scraw. And Xena. Thanks all for the support, much appreciated. At some point, I'm not sure if I want to know what I was saying, but we'll see.
Apparently one of those was fucking in the kitchen.
Well, now we know. Let's move on to Q&A. Q&A segment. We have first one comes from Jason on Discord, who asks, how do you think Shadowlands dungeons compare with BFA ones? Is it still too early to tell?
Yeah, I don't know. It's hard to say that at the moment. I feel like I need a couple more seasons.
Yeah, it is tough to compare the end of BFA experience in dungeons, where we had everything so, memorized about how the dungeon worked, and we knew all these intricacies of how all the different fights worked. Like, you compare like season 1 Skycap and Crag to season 4 Skycap and Crag. You compare, season 1 of all these different strategies we had in dungeons to season 4. There's such a huge evolution. I do think that the Shadowlands ones feel a little bit more on rails than the BFA ones did, which felt more on rails, I think, than the Legion ones did. It seems like there's a lot more pulls where there's really not too much creativity available in route creation for a lot of the Shadowlands ones. It feels like there's a lot of pulls where it's like, okay, like this pull has 4 kicks and 5 targets, and so you can't really add another pull to this. This pull has like some uninterruptible damage thing, so you can't really add any extra stuff to it. So I feel like there's that's how it feels now, but I don't know, maybe I felt this way at the start of BFA as well. This is the kind of thing where it always feels like you know everything, and then you learn something new, and you're like, oh, I didn't know everything.
Well, so many things change too. Like, I mean, obviously this week alone, we had 8 to 10 mobs get nerfed in half with their tank damage. So like that just changes a lot of things alone. I'm sure there'll be a couple more tuning passes as the season goes on, and it might be just completely different by season 2, I think at least after season 1, I'd probably say I could maybe compare the two.
I think that at least the seasonal effects in Prideful makes the dungeons largely more enjoyable. I think if you take the dungeons at face value, I don't know if they're necessarily better. I mean, they're probably, in my mind, they're probably pretty similar. But just to me, I feel like Prideful seasonal effects is a lot more enjoyable to play, so it makes the dungeons a little bit more digestible.
Prideful is nice. It does have an impact on routing, where if you need to hit a 20 or 40% breakpoint, right, going into any given boss, it does kind of narrow the field of possibilities about how you're going to path through a dungeon, right? Like there's a lot of spots where definitely. There's theoretically a lot more possibilities in a dungeon, but then you're like, okay, look, I need prides on these 3 bosses. All of a sudden, there's only a couple of feasible pathways that accomplish that. So I don't know. I mean, I think Pride's a good affix, though. I'm excited for it, but I'm also I'm excited for the next seasonal affix too. I think seasonal affixes are sweet. Let's move on to the next question from Ilotar in Discord, who asked, What would you do to increase the playability of the bastard child specs in the game, i.e. the survival hunters, demonology warlocks, etc., that never have a spot in the raid or M+ meta, and essentially turn the classes into 2-spec classes? I feel like melee specs are especially hurting in this department, as they are both the hardest hit by the target cap, and also have worse single target than the meta range specs.
Well, I think we covered a lot of this earlier with the raid buffs thing. I think that would help.
It does help a lot of it, yeah. A lot of
Yeah.
it is raid buffs. That, you know, if you list out the specs that never have a spot, it is the specs that don't have raid buffs that are included in that for the most part. Although there have been some specs like Windwalker that brought a raid buff and didn't see play all of BFA. And well, in raid, it did see play in M+. I don't know. I mean, I think that some specs, just the fundamentals of some specs are really suited to raid, and other specs don't have those same fundamentals going for them as well. Like you have a spec like Affliction Warlock that just does good single target when it can, you know, good single target, has a couple of good mobility options for itself and good movement globals, and also does good, you know, multi-dotting. And those are just the odds that will be what a fight values is pretty high. And then you look at a spec that, you know, like several of these melee specs don't really have such a useful niche that they consistently fill versus, you know, stacking up against a raid boss.
I mean, you know what's funny though? I feel like Serve Hunter and Enhancement Shaman right now in Mythic Plus are both actually really solid due to the amount of AoE damage they do. Their viability of getting into a raid boss though is definitely substantially lower.
It's tough as well because you know, if you're trying to be a player playing a lot of raid or M+, you probably, especially if you want to do a lot of M+, you probably need to be on a raiding character, right? And so like, you know, the Enhancement Shaman are getting geared 2 or 3 months later. They're not in those first couple of groups. That's also kind of a hidden nerf to those specs in M+, right? Is if you're not good in raid, you don't get to play until you're caught up in gear as much. So I don't know. It's tricky. There's a lot of, I think the melee challenge in general is just there's so few melee spots in raid bosses compared to how many melee classes there are, right? There are more melee specs than range specs, but there are way more range spots than melee spots in the average raid. So you see huge representation of whatever hunter spec, whatever warlock spec, whatever mage spec is good any given tier. And again, even those classes have their arcanes and their demos that are usually not the answer. And then, you know, so few spots to be split between enhancement, feral, survival, even, you know, the Death Knight DPS specs until they got AMZ, all that kind of stuff. There's just not many spots to go around there. It's a really hard problem to solve though. That one is just how do you make melee good in raid? There's not a clear answer that jumps to mind for a good way to do that, besides making them just do more damage by default than their range specs do, which I think is probably, if I had to try something, I would probably just be like, okay, let's just aim the melee specs at 5% higher damage wise than the range specs and see what that does.
I mean, we saw that in Uldir.
Yeah, even then that was a heavy range tier.
Well, I mean, all the melee specs did like 5 to 10% more damage. I mean, the bosses were just so bad.
Yeah, I mean, Cahoon and Mithrax in particular, pre-nerf, was horrible to bring multiple melee on. Because you just have... That's the thing, is you make a mechanic that incentivizes you to spread. Okay, well, there's only so many spread spots near the boss. You make a mechanic that incentivizes people to stack. Okay, well, wherever you stack, the hunter is doing damage. If you're not stacked right on top of the boss, the melee aren't doing damage, right? So the spread and stack mechanics that are most raid mechanics, or like stand in a specific spot, range get to keep doing damage when those mechanics come out and melee don't.
Sure.
It's hard. So yeah, I don't know. I think that's probably what I do. I'd just say, all right, look, there's a hybrid tax. Well, now there's going to be, I'm taking away the hybrid tax, and instead I'm going to give specs a melee bonus. 5 to 10% more damage for being melee. And,
I'm down with that as a melee DPS player in raid. That sounds great.
Yeah, I don't really have a dog in that fight. I don't play DPS this year, and before I played tank, I played both melee and ranged. So I'm just trying to help make things more even.
Yeah, it's definitely a hard dilemma though.
It is hard. Yeah, and there's a strong case that whatever change you tried to make to fix it would just make things worse. That's always the fear whenever you kind of spitball ideas on this kind of stuff. Is like, oh no, would this actually make the game way worse? So I don't know. Maybe it would. All right, those are our questions for this week, and that is our show for this week. We will be back Next
Hold on.
week?
Don't
Okay.
sign us off. I think next week we want to do a little bit longer of a Q&A, I think is what we were talking about before
So,
the show,
okay,
right?
yes. Send us questions. There have been great questions, but next week we might do like a long just Q&A for the whole show or something, or like take a particularly good Q&A question or 2 or 3 and blow them up into 15-minute segments or something like that. So send those in. The Discord is the best place to do it, but we'll look at Twitter and DMs or whatever as well. In-game whispers, if you catch us when we're not busy, Tettles would love to transcribe those and put them into the show notes. So TTV Tettles on Zul'jin. TTV Tettles on Zul'jin. You can also find him on EU, but his character name is remaining a secret. His identity is being
it's not even a secret.
He's in the NA player protection program over there. So he's we're shifting him around between servers on EU and different names every couple days to keep the EU police off of him. Anyways, all right, that's it. That's the end of our show. Bye, everybody.
Bye, guys.